I do want to congratulate Omar and Fobzu on setting up this series. I think it's really, really important. There are probably a lot of people in the room who are already deeply familiar with and care about the Palestinian issue. But I think that by having this series, we're going to spread that message wider and do the educating and awareness raising that's so important for these issues. So without further ado, I shall turn you across to Christopher.
What I want to try and do is to give an introduction to UNRWA's education work, but also give some idea of both the political and institutional context that Caroline's work is conducted in. And what I want to do is approach the subject of this series, of this lecture at any rate, through the prism of the experiences of individual children in our schools. Because I think it's important as we look at what's happening to Palestinians and Palestine refugees, not to lose sight of the fact that there is an individual destiny and a dignity of each child that has to be respected. So with that in mind, can we please go to the first slide? I was in Damascus last week. I spent last week in Syria. And while there, I met a group of girls. They're grade 9 students. And they'd come to Damascus from Yarmouk to take their exams. And as you probably know, for the last month or more, there's been a fierce battle raging between ISIS and the government. And in spite of that, they came out of the camp through this war zone to take their exams. ISIS, they told me themselves, allowed them to go to school 1 day in 10. And when they went to the checkpoint to get out of their school, on 8 separate occasions, ISIS forced them to witness beheadings. So these girls went to school, saw a beheading on the way, did a day at school, came back, and they said to me, the bodies of those who'd been beheaded were hanging on crosses which ISIS had made. And the ISIS fighters took the heads on the floor by the hair and shook them at these girls to frighten them even more. ISIS also banned textbooks. And on one occasion, one of those girls with her father was found to have a textbook and was imprisoned for 4 days. But the story actually has a rather life-affirming aspect. They were about to take their exams. They formed a WhatsApp group, and they photographed textbooks and distributed the pages of their textbooks as their exams loomed in a WhatsApp group. But because they couldn't get coverage on the ground floor, they went to the top floor of their buildings, where Syrian fighter jets were overhead and snipers were firing at them. And in that context, they were preparing for exams. And I hope just that one anecdote gives you an idea of what education means for Palestinian children, and indeed the children coming to our schools. Next slide. That is Yarmouk today. That is the place where these children are being educated. That is the place where these children call their home. ISIS took over the camp in 2014. And today, as you can see, it lies in ruins. And I ask a rhetorical question: what can education mean to those girls, given that that is what has become their future? Next slide. I'd like you next to meet a girl called Noor, also a Palestine refugee, also a student in our schools. In 2007, when she was in grade 2, age 7 or 8, she was living in a refugee camp called Nar el-Barid in Tripoli, in the north of the country. And militants from a group called Fatah al-Islam infiltrated the camp. And as a result, the Lebanese army responded by bombarding the camp from about 1.5 kilometers away. And this is what the camp her home was reduced to. It's not a very good picture, I'm afraid, but it's what we have. The camp was completely destroyed. 31,000 people were made homeless. And Noor went to a nearby camp called Badawi, enrolled in the UNRWA school, and continued her education. She walked 6 kilometers to school from her rented accommodation because UNRWA had to accommodate 31,000 people. She lived in a tiny room with 10 members of her family. And in spite of that, she continued with her education. And today I'm glad to say that in spite of the social marginalization, Palestine refugees are banned from dozens of professions in Lebanon. She continues to work. Next, I want you to meet Mohammed, who I met 10 years ago in Gaza. that he's at the age of 8 in this picture, and in 2014, an Israeli shell changed his life forever. It's a very, very shocking picture. He went to hospital with 3 of his siblings, and he was in a coma, and he woke up completely blind. We then took him to the Erez crossing to get out of Gaza, and the Israelis wouldn't allow his mother to go with him. So a child in that state, we got him into a hospital in Jordan, where there's a very good eye hospital, incidentally, in Amman. He went there. 10 days later, his father was praying in the mosque. The Israelis hit the mosque, and his father was killed. So in the space of 10 days, Mohammed lost both his father and his sight. Let's go to the next slide. We begin to see a pattern emerging, I hope. Yarmouk, Nahr al-Barid, and this is Shujaya, which is in central Gaza, which is what it looked like in the aftermath of the Israeli the war in 2014. Let's go for the next slide. I'm glad to say that Mohammed recovered. We got him some good treatment. Here he is in Valencia, in Spain, where there's also a very good eye hospital. Let's have the next slide. We managed to pilot in our Al-Nur Center in Gaza a thing called Voice Dream Reader, thanks to a very generous donation from Interpal, the UK-based charity. It's an amazing thing. Any visually impaired or blind child can touch the screen of a mobile device, and it will read in one of 37 languages, young voice, old voice, man's voice, women's voice, what's there. So if you want to go to, say, Skype, you put your finger on it, and it will tell you in Arabic Skype. You double-click on it. But what we did is we imported all of grade 1 to 9 textbooks onto these mobile devices. So when a child comes to the Al-Nur Center now, they get given one of these devices with all of their textbooks they will need. But I think it's a testament to the child like Mohammed that there he is, lost the sight in one eye, he can barely see through the other eye, and yet he is determined to finish his education. This is Hakam, who lives in the West Bank village of Wallajah. It's quite near Jerusalem. And like the others, his education is somewhat prescribed. To go to school, his house is on the edge of the village, and to get to school, he's got to go through this gate, which the Israelis have established as part of the infrastructure of occupation. He also has to go through a tunnel. There's what we call settler-only roads. So he's lucky in a way because he can actually get access to the other side, but many Palestinians actually can't get across the road at all. And I wanted to show you this picture because I think it says a lot about Hakam's, first of all, the values. I mean, look at some of these words. Tolerance, citizenship. You know, it talks about the values he espouses, and it talks, I think, also to his aspirations. And I think one of the common threads with all of these stories, the girls that I met in Damascus last week, but also a kid like Hakam, but also Noor in Nahr al-Barid, and certainly Mohammed, they see education as an escape from their realities, occupation in the case of Hakam, blockade in the case of Mohammed, the social marginalization that the Palestinians have in Lebanon, and of course in Syria, the war. Now, I want to leave that slide there. I want to cut to January this year, because all of the education work we are doing with those children that you've just seen is under threat. And it's under threat because the Trump administration in January decided to cut $305 million from our budget, which is about a quarter of our budget. We launched a global fundraising campaign called Dignity is Priceless. And as a result of that, we have raised about $220 million. However, as things now stand, we do not know if we can, Caroline, the director of our education program, does not know if she can open the schools at the beginning of the next academic year. So what is at stake? At stake is the education of 500,000 children. We educate children every day in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. We have 22,000 teaching staff. We don't know if those teachers, if those education specialists will have jobs in September. Our doctors do 9 million patient consultations every year. That is under threat. We feed 1.7 million food insecure people. We empower women through our women's programs. We help vulnerable children. The list goes on and on and on. But I want to begin to wrap this up, because I must let Caroline speak. Although our education program is under threat, and although our financial crisis is a real existential threat to our agency, I want to make a different point, and that is that humanitarian work is not a displacement activity. Humanitarian work is never a replacement for rights and dignity. And the Palestinians will tell you that themselves, that they want to have a future. They want dignity. They want their destinies to be respected. And at the moment, that is not happening. So if it's one thing I think we should all think very hard about, it's not so much the work that UNRWA does. It's about the political framework that we have to give to these people and the political momentum that governments like our own governments have to give in order to give the Palestinians back their freedom, a sense of justice, and a sense of dignity. Thank you very much.
So within all that, I have to think about 526,000 children, and the individual stories are very, very important, but actually the system that supports 526,000 children in our 5 fields of operation is actually, my role. Please, first slide. Okay. So for almost 70 years, UNRWA has worked, and we've worked with UNESCO. UNESCO was actually responsible, had some role in setting up the education program after 1948. And UNRWA was born of conflict. It was born out of the Nakba, and then we continue in conflict. I've been there 8 years now, and I've see the protracted conflict, the daily problems that we have in West Bank. We see the problems in Lebanon that the kids have, and we have problems in the site. Then we saw the Syria war. Then we had the Gaza, 2 wars actually in Gaza, one which was smaller than the big one in 2014. But throughout, this high demand for education, like a really, really high demand. And we're doing some papers at the moment about the history of education in emergencies in UNRWA, and also looking at the curriculum, a kind of very hot issue in UNRWA. And in both of those, you see that throughout the agency's time, this demand for education, it was the refugees themselves that opened the schools in the first place. UNESCO kind of came along a bit later, but it was the refugees who insisted on opening those schools, in the tents, right in the beginning. And we are a pioneer. People talk about this nexus of development versus humanitarian. And education program has to be both, because we are about development, we are about human development, but then we have to respond all the time. We have to respond, and it's like, how do you build a system which is there to educate children in 5 places, in 5 different places, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, Jordan and West Bank, and at the same time be able to respond to emergencies. Next, please. So 526, that will grow this year, because every year we get about 10,000 more children into Gaza. So Gaza grows, our other fields kind of go up and down in terms of their enrolment, and 711 schools. Our schools operate a lot on double shift, i.e. we might have fewer buildings than 711 because we have a school in the morning and a school in the afternoon, some on triple shift. 8 vocational training centres, very important that we're building the capacity of youth, and 2 teacher training institutions. So that's what we've got at the moment. That number will change again with regard to the students in the next month or so. Please, yeah. Okay. So the vision of the education programme over the years has been quality, and I think you made a very good point about, when people are living in such challenging circumstances, they need quality education. So it's not about make-do education. It's going to be about quality education. It has to be about quality in anyone's book. And when I came in 2010, I was asked to reform the programme. It was based on some very substantive evaluation to reform the programme to bring it up to the 21st century. So we began a process, but our vision was actually to help every child reach all the children that you see that Chris talked about, but every child to reach their full potential, but a system that allows them to reach their full potential. And then now we have our medium-term strategy, and the reform's been running for a few years, and now we are very much about quality, inclusive and equitable education, making sure that every child does their best and our system does the best for every child. Next, please. So this is my favourite diagram. This is the reform that we built. So this is a reform, and I think Chris Yates, one of our colleagues here today, was there right at the very beginning. So we started with a reform that would build the systems. UNRWA has systems in place. UNRWA is like a kind of mini Ministry of Education, like a federal state. We have systems, we have systems in place in every field. But we had to kind of go in and we had to build the system. We had to build it at policy level, we had to build it at a structural level, organisational level, and then we had to develop capacity within that. And when I first came, and those of us who are educators out there, it was very much like do some teacher training, and it's like, no, actually, we will not do teacher training, because teacher training alone will not have any impact. We will say what we're trying to achieve in a policy. We will put structures in place in order to achieve it, and then we will build the capacity of our teachers and our people within that, when we know what we're building them for. So that was a little bit of a challenge I had, and I'm sure Chris remembers that, in the first days, of a slight misunderstanding about that. But we strengthened the system. So over the last 7-8 years, we strengthened the system and we developed the capacity of the teachers, but within an overall framework. Next, please. So we were trolling along very nicely with the reform, and a lot of challenges in terms of people who wanted teaching training tomorrow, etc. But then the Syria crisis began. And the Syria crisis was immediate, 2011 it began, 2012, Christmas time, Yarmouk camp emptied, all the main Palestinians were living there, and there was massive displacement. And these are, third generation refugees often, and they were displaced again. And they went to Lebanon, and some of them went to Jordan, fewer of them went to Jordan because of Jordan's own rules about admitting them. And Syria was in complete, upside down. Syria was a really peaceful country. It was one of our fields that was really peaceful before that. It's like everyone wanted to go to Damascus to do a mission because it's such a beautiful place. And suddenly there's complete, utter chaos there. And our team at the beginning, that's what's so interesting, is we kind of learned through them. So the team, the education team in place, all Palestinians, because as Chris said, 22,000 education staff, Palestinians. So whether it's the chief of the field or whether it's the teacher in the class, they're Palestinians. So they very much didn't want to miss out. Like, we must carry on with the reform, we must carry on. And, we were just very glad that they wanted to carry on with the reform. And what we didn't realise was, as they were carrying on with reform, it was actually addressing so many of the needs. Because some of the reform were about teachers coming together and talking to each other professionally. This was providing psychosocial support. So there was so much about carrying on the reform that was really, really vital, not only for the system, to strengthen the system, but also as really providing the kind of support. Because our reform is about quality education, as I said in the middle. It's about a school, a classroom which supports every child. So trying to implement that during this crisis was actually exactly what was needed, a system that supported every child. Please, next one. So, because what happened in Syria was children were out of school, or they were in school one day but out the next. They were moving within Damascus as well, within Syria itself. They were really traumatized as well. They'd lost family and they'd been displaced. There was safety and security issues. There was attacks on schools. There was a concern about walking to and from schools. So actually our school number went down because we couldn't use the schools. They're either in very dangerous areas or they actually were damaged. And there was huge displacement within and then displacement beyond. And then the home environment, the safety and the security and the environment they would want at home was also challenging because their parents and the teachers were all facing this huge challenge. Next, please. So what we had to do was we had to say, okay, don't give up on the systems. We mustn't give up on that. You don't throw your baby out with the bathwater. You've got to carry on strengthening the system. We've got to have something that endures. And after all, this system is to support every child in school. It's not a kind of mechanical system. It's about a system run by Palestinians, for Palestinians, that supports every child in school. So it's like we can't give up on that. So we carry on. But we have to do some things differently. So we knew that children weren't coming into school often. So it's okay, we need to give schooling to them. We need to have maybe television, we need to have computers, we need to have SMSs, we need to do what we can in order to deliver the school. schooling, and we actually had self-learning materials that we developed, and the self-learning materials which were developed by the Palestinian staff, in Arabic for the children, actually were then taken up by UNICEF, who used them for what they call the Whole of Syria program through various NGOs working with children out of school, even in rebel-held areas. So our kids were using the self-learning, we worked on the television, etc. We worked to support so they could get schooling wherever they were. Next, please, Omar. Thanks. But then, and also engaging the parents, because the parents didn't know what to do. So it's like, okay, we want them ideally to come to school, because as Chris said, schooling is really important, and it's a sense of normalcy. It's really important, not just for the kids, but the parents and the community, that school goes on despite everything. So we wanted them to come into school and to do our best, but we just had to be kind of aware that sometimes they needed additional support. Even if they came into school, the hours were reduced. So then we wanted to make sure they had something to do when they went home, whether it's watching TV or looking at a self-learning program. And the parents needed support in that. Like, I don't know how to help my child. What do? You give them the self-learning material. So we had to really think about working with the parents. And then where there were no schools, we set up what we call self-learning centres. So in Damascus Training College, which used to be the vocational training college, it was filled with IDPs, the displaced people. So they lived there, and they lived there for like 6-7 years in the end. Only just now they're moving out. So we tried to set up safe learning spaces within that training college, so the children had somewhere to go, so they can actually, because they'd left their area, which was mainly Yarmouk. So to set up places to support them, where they could go for recreational, as well as academic input. Thanks, Omar. Okay. But the psychological well-being, what do you do about that? I mean, good quality education, we will always argue, if we are educationalists, good quality education does support the psychosocial well-being of a child. Okay. But we had to do more than that. So we had to promote the good quality education, which we did. We carried on doing through everything we were doing, through the reform and everything else we were doing. But we also had to think, okay, much more about this. We had to put in additional counsellors, so psychosocial counsellors to work with children. We had to develop their capacity. We had to develop the capacity of the teachers to more directly support, as well as kind of generally. And also we had to think about them as well, because they were also suffering as well. So we had to think about their well-being. And we had to really encourage a lot of recreational activities. So we get that kind of combination of in the classroom, extra counsellors, and recreational activities. So this was something we did before, but we had to do more of it. So we were doing something different in that we were delivering the school in a different way. We were doing more of things we did before, which was psychosocial, but much more targeted. Next, please, Emma. Thanks. And then something we hadn't particularly done before in education was safety and security. So we had to do new things. So we had to really think about the safety and security, and we had to develop the capacity of students and teachers and parents to be able to evacuate the school. We used an SMS system to tell parents, it's okay, come and get your child now, or don't bring them to school tomorrow. And we had to do school risk assessments and make sure that those assessments were actually, not only carried out, but then we actually responded to them and followed up. So this was something we hadn't in education had that much responsibility before. So now as an education programme, we had to make sure that all these things were in place, because obviously many children weren't coming to school because parents were frightened. And we did have a tragedy not long ago, didn't we, in Syria, where children did die on the way to school. So it's a very vulnerable time when they're walking to and from school. So we had to try and put up systems there and use simple technology and as I said, build the capacity. Okay? The infrastructure, well, the government actually of Syria lent us schools. So they lent us about 48 schools that we operated in the second shift of, because we lost so many of our own schools. So we went in the second shift into their schools, But we also had to work, as I said, again, broadly. We had to think about, well, not only now in these schools, and this is a picture, I think, Gaza school, but we have to think about longer term, because we have to think about, well, what do we need to do to our schools to make sure they are safer, and what can we do and without completely redesigning them. So we had to kind of really work on that element too. Omar, thanks. And then, of course, the teachers, who were kind of like there throughout. So really, again, a lot more support to teachers, much more targeted, because the teacher has to make sure the children's capacity to evacuate the school is in place. It's the teacher who has to engage with the parents, and we have many daily paid teachers. Many of our staff fled. They fled to some places where they do work for us, but they also fled a lot to Sweden and to Egypt and to beyond. So we have what was called daily paid teachers. These are teachers with less experience, and we really had to think about how we could support them to support the children as well, and to encourage them to work together. Thanks. Okay. And then where they went to, you know, and there's a lot about education in emergencies, and now it's very interesting because UNHCR and UNICEF are much more supporting the integration of refugee children, and the new Global Compact on Refugees, which is being discussed at the moment, is very much about the integration. So we would be trying to integrate those children. First of all, they did go into separate classes. The Syrian kids went into separate classes in the UNRWA schools, our Palestinian children. But we had to make sure that we began to think of how to integrate. There were challenges of language, actually, because in Syria they learn completely in Arabic, and in Lebanon they learn certain subjects in French, you know, so, and English and French, sorry. English, they would like to learn them in French, but some people, they learn them in English. There is a small French contingent. So we had to really think about that as well. But also, if you start just targeting the Palestine refugees with activities, all the other children get a bit fed up. So and the others, you know, who are also Palestine refugees, are like, what are you doing? So we had to make sure that we actually included all the children in these types of activities as well, and getting the community engagement, because that whole issue of some social integration and social cohesion, that we mustn't kind of do something which makes it worse when people who are also living in a kind of conflict are not getting the support that UNRWA is providing. Thanks. Next one. Okay. But very important, like for any education program, for anything, is to measure it. And it's very difficult to measure education in emergencies because some of your, what we call universal indicators, don't apply. Like your definition of dropout is from October to October. That's the definition of dropout. If a child is there in October and the next October, if they're not, then they dropped out. It's not October to November or October to December. Now, children in an emergency come and go. They move in and out, they transfer across, but they also stay at home. It's disrupted education. So trying to find a way of measuring what was actually happening in Syria, particularly in terms of these children, you know. And actually the impact of everything we were doing, what's it actually doing to their well-being? So it's really important that if you're trying to do something in an emergency context, that you measure. You continue to measure the big picture, which is our education system, but you also have to measure the actual realities, and also what was happening in the classrooms in Syria. Was it really supporting their psychosocial well-being? You know, were fewer children dropping out? So really to try and get the measurement, and we're still working on that. Next one, Omar. Okay. Then Gaza came along. So in Syria war, we're going forward, 2000, we've got our reform, then we've got the response to the Syria crisis, 2011, 2012, 2013, and then there was a war in Gaza. And that was like completely different, you know, sudden, horrific. All our schools were actually full of IDPs, and as it happened, it was the school holidays. But the horror, you know, the schools being damaged, being attacked, there are horrible stories at night, the school being bombed, finding a classroom that was bombed, and people died, even though it was a UN school. The two little boys that the mother said they could go and get orange juice at the gate, you know, from a street vendor who never came back, you know, at like 10 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, real horror there. So we had this complete disruption. We had 3,000 children injured, 1,000 permanently disabled, and a complete disruption. Now, it was the school holidays, but the school year came, you know, and we needed to start the school year. And the war had, you know, in theory, had finished at that time. Now, at this time, because it was the school holidays, it wasn't really, people weren't thinking about education, and it's like, those kids are there. And I went to Gaza at the time, and they've got very big playgrounds, and it was July. And the very big playgrounds don't have any shading. So all the people who are living there and sleeping there, and the children, were all living around the perimeter. And there was like hardly anything going on, you know. And so to get some activities going on for the kids, because yes, it's holidays, but these are still children and they're kind of living there. They haven't even got a ball to throw. So really trying to think, we have to do something even in holiday time. We have to bring them together. We have to give them some sense of normalcy. We have to give them opportunities to play. So really trying to, and we learnt a lot through the Gaza war actually because of that taking place, you know, actually during school holidays. But then going back to school, and the government, the Palestinian government, wanted to go back straight away, and they wanted to go back straight away to normal. And it's like, well, I don't think we can go straight away back to the normal schooling, because even though all our efforts, you know, it's still a fairly curriculum-heavy schooling, and it's still a certain kind of traditional model, even though we fight to change it. And I had one 13-year-old, I remember standing up talking to me when we were talking about school in before the end of the war, and she said, I can't just go back to school like that. I can't just go and pick up a book, you know, and I can't do it. It has to be different. I can't. And then the area education officers, who are kind of in our hierarchy of support, they have been looking after the shelters. and actually all day exhausted by actually looking after the shelters and people in the shelters. And they were like, no, it can't be the same. And it's like, well, actually, we can't go back like that. We have to have a different approach. We have to break those children in gently. But we do need to go back. So it's not about leaving them for weeks and weeks and thinking they'll recover. We've got to get them back. So Omar, next one. So we had a phased approach. And we'd learned a lot from Syria, and we certainly learned a lot from Gaza for Syria after that. So first of all, they went back and they played. And there's great pictures of children, shaking flags and playing games. They played. They had recreational activities, at the beginning. And then there was an idea of a transition phase, which was an idea of more open learning and investigations, and actually all good stuff that you would want to do in any school, any time, but trying to, really working with the teachers to support them in that. And then it's like the final phase was returning to the normal curriculum. And the PA, the Palestinian Authority schools in Gaza, did the same. And they did the same with the support of their partners like UNICEF. So that kind of phased approach in like not going straight back in, but really taking everything we know about the need for recreational and psychosocial. Thank you, next one. So what does it mean? Are we actually doing anything? Is it all nice stuff, but it's actually not achieving anything? Because it has to achieve something, as I said, with that vision of quality education. So we have, in terms of impact, we had a World Bank study, which was a few years ago, but it really looked at how UNRWA manages to operate an education system in adversity. And it looked at, actually, we were doing well, and it said we'd do better in terms of learning than one additional year. But it also said about finding a purpose. It said why we did well, finding a purpose in education, modelling positive identities. Our teachers are Palestinians, and promoting that well-being, the psychosocial, and integrating. This is the findings of their report. And the whole community, and I always say, we have a community out there. We are Palestinians working to support Palestinians. So we do have a community. And again, the accountability for the learning and protection. So that was the World Bank findings. Thanks, Omar. Next one, please. And then our own annual report. We do an annual report. It's very, very rigorous. We're a UN, very rigorous. We have indicators, and they're all universal indicators, etc. And we're measured, and we report to donors, and they always ask you about the one tiny thing that's gone down by 0.5%. They never ask you about the things that have gone up by 10%. They always want to know why. And our report every year is a little bit of uncertain. We're always a bit unsure what the data we get from the 5 fields is. But actually we found that despite all this, plus of course the actual idea of having no money, and I should have mentioned that earlier, that in 2015 we had to increase our class size to 50 children. So this was a kind of an initiative that was brought in 2015, so to have a maximum of 50 children where they could fit, where we have what we call purpose-built schools. So we'd already had that, and a lot of austerity and a lot of cutting down and reduction in teacher numbers. So despite all that, we'd actually maintained a high student survival rate, i.e. kids had stayed in school from grade 1 to 9. And our dropout rate was the lowest since before the reform. So as I said, we're all shocked too when we get this. We kind of, it's all very rigorously done, and then we look at it and think, wow, And our children did better. So as I said, we've been really striving through the reform and everything we did to try to have a more equitable system. And if you want something, you measure it. So we measure equity. We actually say we want children to come up. We don't care that the average is 70%. We want to have performance levels, and we want children who are in the bottom performance level to go up. And we're going to put an indicator. We're going to measure that. So we measured that children moved up, and our children did move up. So we saw a moving up. So it didn't affect, nobody moved down, everybody just moved up. And then we found that people had a very positive perception of the education. We did 27,000 kids, teachers, parents, about their perception of the education. And funnily enough, in Syria, they were like the most positive, particularly with regard to safety and security, because we asked some questions about safety and security. So they had this perception, very positive perception. And then Syria was our most successful field this year. So it had the lowest dropout rate and the highest and most gender equitable achievement, because normally girls leave the boys behind, but this time we got a few boys up. And they were the most positive. So this was kind of incredible, that Syria, through all this, had actually, with all the efforts that had been made and with the commitment of the staff, which cannot be overlooked, that with all this, that Syria had actually had the highest results. They did the best in this agency-wide test, which measures whether children can think, etc. It really tries to measure thinking skills and performance levels. And they did better than all the other, what we call our fields. So that was kind of like, wow, this kind of approach, we have to say, and we can never say 100% sure that it was that, but we can say, look, we were doing this and this happened, so let's hope there is a definite link between them. Thank you, next one. So, and also we were chosen as a promising, I think that was a bit insulting, it should be best practice, but we were chosen as a promising practice by the UN. We went in, if we had to send our case study, and we were chosen, and our work was celebrated at the UN General Assembly in last September in terms of the work we're doing, and they really rated what we were doing in terms of the whole approach. Thank you. Next one. Oh, there's supposed to be another one. Okay, the other one is what we learned. It should have been there, but I obviously cut it out. So what we learned is, we learned that you don't give up on the systems, and for my colleague back there, systems are people. So, systems is not a dry thing. A system is designed for people, and it's contextualized by the people, and people then interpret it as they want. So you design a system with the people in mind, whether it's attitudes, whether it's structures, behaviours, capabilities, and then the people will contextualise it anyway. So we learned that systems, yes, but also innovation. Do more of some things, do some things differently, and do things you never did before. And then we also learned as well that work with people. So we worked with colleagues. So UNICEF, as I said, has taken the UNRWA programme. We work with the Norwegian Refugee Council. We work with the International Network of Education in Emergencies. We work, of course, with UNESCO, the Arab League. They have an Arab Education in Emergency strategy. UNRWA contributed to that, and it's in there. So I think the education in emergency work of UNRWA actually became something that other people wanted to know about and to actually take from. So to work with people, and as I said, very important to measure it, because it's all very well saying psychosocial support, etc., but we really need to know if it's making a difference. So that is what we tried to do for the 526, which are, they are full of little, the cases like Chris, and when I go into the classes, there's lots of really sweet children in stripy dresses, and they're just incredible. The kids are incredible, actually, out there. They're incredible, and they're so friendly, and they're so interested, and you go in and you see 15-year-old boys, and they're just the same, and they're so polite, and it's just amazing, especially, if you have taught in inner London, albeit decades ago. So they're very special children, and the teachers are very committed, and we will continue until, we cannot anymore due to funding, but we will do what we can within the ongoing challenging context. Thank you.